Hello, in this lecture we will take a look at this one very important security option, and actually it's not just about the security, it's about the connection to the database. Once you go into the remote connections, you won't be able to use Windows Authentication. So you will need to use SQL Server Authentication, for which you will need to create some users. So to do that, you go to the specific, you can either go to the specific database or you can go server wide. So in this case I will go into server wide, and you go into the security folder. You go into the security folder, and as you can see you have different things here. You have credentials, server roles, cryptography providers. You have all these different things, but for now we won't get into any of those. These are all very useful for very specific cases, and especially when you need some extra security. But to have the most simple connection, you simply go to the logins and you right click on that and you add new login. And here you have several options. You can have Windows Authentication or SQL Server Authentication. Now obviously we won't need Windows, so we go to SQL Server. And here is where the trouble starts. So you can enter the password. Let's say I will enter the password. Let's do test. The password is test, and then the name test user. Test user I'll do. Now whatever password you make, you should remember, because we are going to use the same connection in the next lectures. So that is when we will deal with the programming languages. Now we have that, and you have these different policies. You have enforced password policy, enforced password expiration. User must change password at next login. You don't need any of that. Most of the time you do not. If you need that, you should read the documentation for that. It's very clear. It's very clear what it does. Basically, the user might be forced to change the password, but this is only useful if you are giving the password to an actual user, an actual human. If you are using that in the program, you just put it in some configuration file or just in the plain code, and you use the password like that. In fact, you are not using just the password, you are usually using the whole connection string. Now, you can also use some other options. You can authenticate with certificate or with asymmetric key. We won't get into that. And you can also map to credential. We don't need that. Now you have the full database and all that. You don't need to change any of that as well. So then you have the server roles in this tab box, select page box rather, page navigator. Server roles, you go to server roles. So you have different server roles. Now, you usually go with public. Because if you assign different roles, we will be able to create different things. So for example, if you give the authority for the user to be DB creator, which obviously stands for database creator, we will be able to create databases. And then if you do say security admin, we will be able to change the security credentials. We will be able to change passwords for the logins, which is something that usually you do not want to give permission to. So let's go to user mapping. User mapping is very interesting. As you can see, you can map this login to specific databases. Now you see these 4 databases: master, model, MSDB and tempDB. These are all default ones. You do not have to touch them at all. But you have test database, which is our database for testing. So you check that. And now that user will be able to log into that specific database. So here you have database role membership. So again, this will allow the login to do certain things with that specific database. So this is not server-wide anymore. This is just database-wide. And you should have DB data writer and then DB data reader. As you can see, the language is quite humanly perhaps, and it's quite simple, it's quite suggestive, it's quite straightforward. So you will usually know what you're clicking on and what each permission actually does. Now we assign data writer, so we will allow to write, and then data reader will allow to read. The backup operation, we will get into that later, but that will allow obviously to do backup operations. And then you have owner and security admin, so those are quite obvious. And then you can go to the securables. In these, we won't get into that. You don't really need to look into that yet. And then you have different statuses here. So you can actually enable or disable if you need the login. If you feel like someone is abusing the login, you simply click on that, click OK, and you've disabled the login. You can feel very secure. And then you have permission to connect to database engine. Obviously you need to grant that. So we have everything up and ready to go. And now let's click OK. And as you can see, we already have the user. And then in the next lecture, we will actually get into the different connection strings that are available. So connection strings, you can't really build that automatically. You can't generate it. You have to build it on your own. It has several key value pairs, and you put them in one string, and then you use that string as a connection string. So you see how that's done, and for different drivers it's done differently. And with that, we will conclude this lecture.